Hi everybody, thank you for attending our today's workshop in the Ask an Expert series. Today it's been held by the North East Young Planners Committee, of which I am the chair, and Daniel, who will be asking and chairing today's workshop, is also on the committee. Just to let you know that you've all been muted, but there is a discussion towards the end, so if you'd be happy to ask any questions for Tim, please do so in the questions box on your, what can we call that, the interface of GoToWebinar. Other things are, it'll be running for approximately 40 minutes before the Q&A session, and there'll also be a handout of the presentation sent to you at the end. So just a quick introduction. My name's Katherine. I'm the chair of the Young Planners Committee in the North East. I just want to give you a very quick plug of what's happening in the North East in the next few months. We've obviously run this workshop today, but we're also looking to run a quiz coming up on the 25th of November. So everyone's welcome to that. Have a look on the RTPI webpage. Today, though, we will be focusing on design and planning, and specifically how best to deal with design dimensions in planning, held by Tim Crawshaw, who's with us, and Daniel will be chairing it with that. So Daniel, if you want to quickly introduce yourself, and then Tim, can you start the presentation? That'd be great.
Sure, thank you, Katherine. Hi, I'm Daniel. I'm a planner at MHCLG in the Planning Directorate in the Civil Service. And I've been on the North East Committee for about a year now, when I helped organise the conference last year. I'll just hand over to Tim to do a quick introduction on himself as well.
Thank you, Katherine. Thank you, Daniel. Okay, well, my introduction is sort of in my presentation, so I shall go through that because it's got some bullet points. So can everybody see that? Okay, we all cool? Yeah.
Perfect.
Brilliant.
Thanks, Tim.
Right, smashing. Okay, right. Well, I'll introduce myself. So my name's Timothy David Crawshaw. I'm the regional chair of the Royal Town Planning Institute in the North East, and some of you may know the vice president-elect. My first training is in architecture, so I did that for well, much of the 7-year period before I left the whole shooting match and went travelling and designed greetings cards, became a gardener and a whole range of things before I got back into the built environment. I've had a multidisciplinary design practice for many years. And I think that's really had no boundaries really in terms of the sort of things that I would cover, whether that was graphics, objects, web, innovative presentations, all sorts of things. So I've been involved in all that, but I've got a master's in urban environmental design and I've got 15 years of local government experience before I ended up being totally working for myself, although I've always just kept working on projects and on the outside of local government through all that time as well. I provided design training with Trevor Roberts Associates since 2007. You may be aware that they're no longer around because of the pandemic, which is a shame really, because I've always enjoyed getting around and I've met quite a lot of colleagues at various different councils around the country and talked through design matters. Worked with the UNDP on Green Cities since 2014, became a chartered town planner in 2017. And I guess I've developed a specialism in characterisation and design codes, which I'd say from my point of view is quite opportune, considering this seems to be, well, certainly design coding appears to be quite a big deal now, really, with the what's in the planning white paper and everything else. I'm filling some very, very eminent shoes today. So originally we're going to have Professor Colin Haylock, and I'm very privileged to be here with you today. And I hope some of the stuff that I'm going to talk about will resonate with you, but also perhaps give you an insight into how design does work in planning, or perhaps even being a bit provocative about what it is we're actually trying to achieve through good design, or whether a good design is something that you can codify or not. But we'll go through that journey together. Okay, when I first got into the built environment, shall we say, I was looking out the window. This isn't the actual window, it's not far off the view. And then for the want of anything else to say in my architecture interview, I said I want to sort stuff like that out. And they seem to be quite inspired by this, because obviously this is what we now see as being town or cities, with all the infrastructure that goes with it, predominantly based around the private car. so effectively the urban motorway and all that, which 30 odd years ago, you know, it was what you saw was almost seemed commonplace, but then when you dig around into it, you can see that the impact this has had both on the planet, but also on you know, health outcomes and everything else. The private car has really defined how cities have ended up being developed with big ticket infrastructure, and I suppose something in me wanted to change that and try and get back to something that was a little bit more human centric and a bit more accepting or recognizing that the places that we're building need to be habitats for ourselves and support our health and well-being, and there is no separation really between ourselves and nature. And I think I've probably seen that transformation in the last 30 years, that perhaps there's a greater understanding of that. People don't look at you in like you got, you know, some crazy ideas when you say that. So I think there is a better understanding now of our place in the natural environment as well. One thing I would say is by the time planning applications come in, this is nothing to do with Greenpeace really, other than the fact the analogy that I use is by the time the application's in, you really are at the pipe end. And you may have heard terms that say rubbish in, rubbish out and everything else. Broadly speaking, if the applicant hasn't done their homework, and indeed you haven't been clear about what it is you were after, you could end up with a you know, pretty poor proposals coming across your desk and you're having to deal with them. And I've worked in different aspects of local authorities and been you know, the urban designer who's commented on planning applications as they come in. And there are various things which we can have in the question and answer session that can help to actually improve proposals before, you know, even at the pre-app stage, because effectively if you have like a strong design guide or a strong design supplementary planning document, for example, people have already read the manual, then it takes a few months and maybe a few years, but broadly speaking, if you can set the tone through strong design guidance, you do tend to get stuff that's got less rough edges by the time it comes in, and you actually end up talking about some of the sort of finer points rather than I used to characterize it was, well, I'll tell you what, wouldn't it be great if it just faced the street? Now that would be a good start, wouldn't it, you know? So you know, I think the conversation, the quality of the conversation that you're having can be improved if you can actually try and work upstream, as I say, and upstream is around setting the tone in terms of design guidance, trying to get in early in terms of negotiations and everything else, because design isn't actually a bolt-on. You know, design and planning are, to take the old rhetoric, the same continuum, to be fair. So really, you can't really plan anything unless you design it, you know, and you've got to think with the designer's head on, I think, to plan things in a way that basically secures the maximum in terms of benefits out of the thing that you're doing. Far more efficient that way. So the backdrop really isn't an easy time to be a planner, and if you're the guardian of, or you know, if you have been the guardian, or you are the guardian, I guess, of quality standards, you might start thinking that there's a bit of a mismatch here between somehow that planning is getting in the way, and we're going to build and everything else, and also the fact that somehow we have an entirely broken system, and the way to solve it is to completely throw it up in the air again and start again. None of which I think is entirely true. I actually don't think we should be characterizing it in terms of any sort of philosophical battle. In many ways, there's been lots of different attempts to try and deconstruct what planning does, and broadly speaking, it ends up in the same stuff, because if you need the same checks and balances, probably whatever you're doing, and here's a good case in point that somehow it's all this guy's fault, getting in the way of everything. And you can see he clearly feels a bit, what's the word, outraged, I think, by this aspersion that him and his friends are getting in the way of development. At the end of the day, you know, we have a responsibility to protect the environment. This is a protected species. It wouldn't seem unreasonable, unless we're going to change everything, to think that that's something that you would need to take into account. I've been reading things like we all have, Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission. Fantastic document in many ways, if you like reading lots and lots and lots and lots of words. And one thing in a document that really does have very few pictures in it, and I've got not a cynical view, but maybe a realistic one, that it's actually very difficult to say what it is. And most people don't want to nail their colours to the mast and say, well, that's good design and that's not good design and this and that and everything else. And very few images were in there that will give you an idea of what was. Broadly speaking, here's one though. I did manage to pull one out. and it's got a few qualities about it. It looks like it's relatively traditional materials with relatively traditional window proportions. I mean, luckily it's got what I call a bottom, middle and a top, so it meets the ground. It's got like a main course in the middle, and it's got the icing on the cake. And broadly speaking, you would recognize it as, as a building, a traditional building that basically fills its site, and you might reasonably expect it to do so if it was in town, So broadly speaking, there you are. It fills the street, it fills the plot. It's an appropriate sort of scale and everything else. So here's one picture of what good design might look like. And again, you could see the cues in that, and I haven't really got a huge argument with it. But actually, I don't think it necessarily says very much about how we are and where we are right now in terms of other priorities and everything else. And we'll touch on some of that later. But broadly speaking, it's relative out. It's okay. So there's an example. You'll find though in the document when you read it, there isn't really a huge amount to give you any idea what beautiful actually is. And I'll try and drill down into a bit of that later on as well in what I'm going to talk about. So the priorities: beautiful buildings considering windows. Well, it's always a good one to argue about. Height, space and materials, all of which, yes, you can have a conversation in terms of a design conversation around, and I've got very strong views about how windows are proportioned in a brick building, for example. Usually it's pretty obvious in terms of height and that sort of thing. So on materials, quite clearly, although brick isn't brick. There's lots of different kinds of brick, lots of different ways of putting brick together. Beautiful places, the spirit of place, the nature of streets, squares and parks, all very good. And it's, I mean, if you could actually drill down into that, into something that was meaningful, because lots of people have lots of different views about what those different things mean. Spirit of place is an incredibly intangible concept that is used quite a lot, is bandied about. You might even hear the more posh version, which is sort of genius loci, which I will touch on later. But broadly speaking, this concept of the spirit of place and everything else, yeah, you can do this, but this is actually, to me, really quite subjective in terms of where the priorities might lie, what the objectives are. And then beautifully placed, sustainable settlement patterns in the right place and sitting well in the landscape all seems perfectly reasonable. I think that there's a tension between what the priorities of this document are, which is basically making development acceptable to existing communities, and then with the other subtext is that most existing communities don't really want another layer of the onion outside them, because when they bought their house, they were on the edge of the countryside and everything else. So I'm not sure it's quite as simple. I think it'll be cited as being a reason why people are deeply uncomfortable about new development, because it's not beautiful enough. But if you want my sort of relatively cynical view, I think there's far deeper things going on than just that. Although all these are very, very laudable aims, so I'm not saying anything bad about it in that sense. As you can see, there are a wide variety of concepts to do with architecture about what might constitute beautiful. I've just got a couple here, a couple of Frank Gehry's and a Zaha Hadid. By anybody's standards, you could have a really wide-ranging discussion about whether these things are actually beautiful or not. I potentially like one more than the other. And that's the worst conversation you can possibly have with an applicant, and the worst possible conversation you can have if you are trying to justify something is, well, is either the case of whether I like it or not. And I do hear that, and I've heard that in negotiations with planning colleagues. Well, I don't like it. Well, actually, that really doesn't matter, And I think it's very difficult, whether you like it or not, if there's an objective reason for what it is and why it's like it is. I think you have to listen to that. And sometimes as well, I think the other thing you've got to bear in mind is that, having studied architecture for quite some time, that you spend about 7 years learning how to do catwalk, when actually most people need pret-a-porter. Most people actually need a functioning pair of jeans that fits them and is going to last them a while. And to be fair, we're not all doing the star pieces. And broadly speaking, you will hear a lot of stuff that justifies things that basically, I'm not saying that the commonplace shouldn't be beautiful, but the commonplace should be something that is actually really well made, well considered, and actually can be based a bit on tradition. I live in a, people talk about, standard house type. So I live in a 1920s semi, and people say, can I use your toilet? And they go, yeah, of course. I say, where is it? I say, where do you think it is? Top of the stairs. Because broadly speaking, it's over the kitchen. And that's where the bathroom was and everything else. And then you got 2 sort of major rooms and maybe a 3rd smaller one. And that's, you read the building like that, and that works quite well. It's got enough space on the side to extend it. It's quite resilient. That's why people like living in them. And broadly speaking, it's a form that kind of works. There's nothing wrong with house types. There's nothing wrong with forms that work. But there's actually quite a lot of dysfunction in some of the forms that we are currently being asked to live in and buy, typically. So, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And I do think there is a place for absolutely, cutting edge architecture. But I think it needs to be very much consciously that thing. And I think if you're trying to be a good fit with a context, I think there's a job of work to be done in the first instance to be able to understand that context and respond to it appropriately. And this one here, the Zaha Hadid one's typical of the sort of things you see in the architecture mags, to be fair, which, to be fair, I'm not saying anybody can, but most people could come up with something sculptural in the middle of a large open space with nothing next door to it. And they're the sort of things that you do tend to see quite a lot, and that's when you see in the magazines and everything else, and you go, oh, that's what architecture's about. And broadly speaking, making and designing buildings is actually far more to do about building and tradition, probably. Anyway, National Design Guide has been out for some time now, and this talks about context, identity, the built form, movement, nature, public spaces, uses, homes and buildings, resources, and lifespan. All of which you could deconstruct. I've seen many different design documents, and broadly speaking, they all talk about the same things. There's nothing in this that's cutting edge, and nothing wrong with that either, because broadly speaking, it does sort of gather up most of the things that are kind of important in terms of design. And I think there's a big recognition, again, that it's not just about what it looks like. It is largely as well about how it functions and works and everything else. So drilling down into this, you'd think, well, a well-designed place, climate, character, community. And I think lifespan, made to last, and that's good, resilient forms. And I think you've got to think about not just the actual materials or whether the roof's going to keep functioning or whatever, but actually, is it a form that you can extend? And you do see quite a lot of new developments. So the 2.5-story house, well, you've got no loft conversion possibilities, have you? And actually, if you've got a tiny garden and it's 1 metre from the neighbour, that's it. That's all you can ever do with it. You can't actually do anything with it. You can't really expand it. So in that sense, I think it stops being resilient and actually just starts being a bit fixed, really. Context enhances the surroundings, and that is absolutely right. And new design, new buildings, and everything else should at least seek, in many ways, to enhance the actual surroundings of themselves. Many new developments, of course, you will see have a great big fence around them, and it's like, whoa, all that stuff out there. We're not having anything to do with that. And actually doesn't make any attempt to enhance the surroundings, which I think is very, very disappointing. And we've all driven past housing developments where the thing you can see is the fence rather than the actual houses. Identity, attractive and distinctive. Now, I'm quite strong on something else here, because I actually think places do have an identity as well. So an attractive and distinctive identity in its own right, effectively in a little quarter or with a line around it and say all that, I don't think fully answers that question, because I think that there are very strong regional traditions in terms of how things are built and how things are made, even down to things like roof pitches or the materials palette that you're using and everything else. And obviously, as everybody knows the story, as the railway came along, you had a far greater choice about what your buildings were made out of. So you did tend to get more homogenic sort of forms of development and everything else across the country. But broadly speaking, those clues are still there in terms of responses to climate and the like. So it's no accident that you got the Lake District and this slates across the top of the chimneys, because it rains quite a lot. And certainly if you go to alpine regions, you get rather shallow pitch roofs that are designed to actually have a layer of snow on top for insulation in winter and everything else. Built form, a coherent pattern of development, absolutely brilliant. That's really what we should be looking for, is actually things that seamlessly work with each other. You have a network of streets, it might have a different character along those streets, but broadly speaking, it's sort of, you do have a sense of natural surveillance and building lines and all those things. Plugs into movement, accessible and easy to move around. Nature enhanced and optimized. I think there's a greater realization now, and it's great to think that we need to be thinking about how do we bring green infrastructure right into the center of our towns and cities. Real opportunity there. We might just have got over the hump in terms of the people's views about things like green roofs, although it's still a long way to go if we're going to take every opportunity to bring nature into our towns and cities. Public spaces, safe, social and inclusive. Use as mixed and integrated. One of the hardest things I think in my career up to now has been certainly trying to achieve proper, vertical and horizontal mixed use is really difficult. And I think there's lots of reasons why that doesn't happen. Few of which are actually to do with planning. I think there's a lot more to do with things like environmental health and things like that, and keeping things apart. That you might want a really funky bit of town, but broadly speaking, you're not going to get it because something is just perceived as just not mixing. Whereas when you go on holiday, and I do have the thing called the postcard test, really great funky places you send postcards off, often would never have had planning. We'd never get planning permission for, and probably never did either. So there's something around the planning for the unplanned and the sort of funky mix of things. I just think at the moment we aren't very good at articulating or securing. Homes and buildings, functional, healthy and sustainable, can't really argue with that. And then around resources, efficient and resilient. So if you think about the whole life costing really of a particular material choice, there's a huge scope for timber frame to be the means by which we do, build things now because of the advantages in terms of those materials. So there we are. Here we are. What you will find quite entertaining is, and I'm sure you have all read this from cover to cover, is that some of the pictures still seem to be banging on about the same things that people were banging on about 20 years ago. In fact, that Ford Orion is definitely showing the age of that particular view of how a street might work. So, there are some things in there that yeah, it's great, but we've spent the last 15 to 20 years sort of in many ways not getting them. And that kind of thing. So it makes it that little bit harder sometimes when you look at it to go, well, so what are we going to do then? Because most of the time we don't end up securing stuff like this, and most of us will know about the stuff we do end up securing. Here's another example of the use of design coding. So this is Poundbury, and this is, an example of a very, very, very tight design code that's been applied, and we've got this reference now to the National Model Design Code. This one's a really, really, really detailed one. It was relied a lot on craft training. So a lot of these things actually require people to be able to put a canopy on, like you can see over the door there. I've had some rather entertaining arguments with some of the national house builders about, oh, you're not going to put those pointy ones on, are you? And they go, well, yeah. And we don't have the ones like that round here. And they go, well, yeah, we can't put anything else on. You go, well, why? And they go, well, because we don't know how, or our lads don't know how, etc. And you're like, oh, right, okay. So there's been a lot lost in terms of what we can, what we should be asking for, but there's been a lot lost in terms of skills. And this obviously, to achieve this sort of thing, does require people actually having some sense of traditional building techniques and, and everything else. And it is said, actually, it's such a tight design code that if you don't have a box of Dutchy originals in your pantry at any time, you can be evicted. So just watch out if you're there. You may well have seen other design codes. When I first got back into things 20 years ago or whatever, this was everything. So design codes were the answer to everything. And broadly speaking, they do provide some certainty. Although I will flash up. There's the bottom left. It's a really good example of how you can end up with just really quite regimented stuff, though. And I'll just give you another example here. So here's a Dutch example. And broadly speaking, there's a degree of variety, but can you not see as well? Well, I feel anyway, a degree of absolute monotony that sort of goes with it too. So I think you've got to be careful. I think the lower image helps a little bit, that there is a bit of variety, but broadly speaking, you've got to be really careful with design codes that you do actually try and get to that thing I was talking about, which was sort of planning for the unplanned, shapes and forms of things that don't quite fit, the sort of thing that actually has to develop over time. I feel you can get there through characterization and everything else, but I don't think that design codes up to now have been sophisticated enough to be able to pick up on that in a way that actually secures the outcomes that you're after. So again, happy to take views later on or questions, but I do think there are some dangers to design codes that actually do end up really not so much stifling innovation, but certainly people will probably most of the time go with the max or it will just become something like a potato stamp where it's just repeated. And I think there'll be I think there's got to be a lot more of a subtle discussion about what goes into design codes. Can't say I've not done one. So here's one I made earlier. This is what I call the fried egg map, which is the yolk in the middle. And this was Darlington's design SPD from 2012. Quite audaciously, I felt, and I think some other people did as well. What I would say probably one of the first attempts of a form-based design code to be adopted in the UK. And there's some, there's some bits in here that may be relevant. I don't know. I mean, it's certainly still on people's desks and being used. I'll go through some of the qualities of it. But broadly speaking, going from the centre, the blue section in the centre is the actual town centre, but the town centre that was there before the ring road went in, before it was like effectively the concrete collar, defined what was actually quite a linear town centre into being one that on the face of it looked quite constrained. And then just outside that is what I call the sort of donut of despair that's around most town centres. It's your kind of route up to the station, your kebab shops, your hand car washes, that sort of stuff. And then outside that's your inner suburbs, and then the outer suburbs, and the yellow stuff being employment. So these were effectively just taking a transect, as I say. If you looked at smart code, that was the precedent, and smart code takes a transect like a slice from your town centre out to the countryside. And that was the basis for the design code, which raised some eyebrows, I've got to say, but carried the argument to an extent, and that became adopted and everything else. And I'll show you some of the stuff that was in that. The little blue polka dots you can see are effectively local centres or local transport nodes, where broadly speaking you might reasonably catch a bus, but also get some shopping and everything else. And some of those were existing villages that had been, washed over by the expansion of the town, and they had their own special design coding to accept that you might want things like shop fronts and buildings up to the pavement and everything else. So, and actually flexible ground floors, which was another thing that was put in there. So, for example, in Zone 2, which is that bit just outside the town centre, up to 5 stories maximum. Ground floor uses to be suitable and flexible for commercial use as well. So that was quite a strong element in that, and it was secured in some developments. So in the future, should the town centre need to expand outwards or back the other way, there's enough flexibility in the buildings that you don't just end up with that awful situation where you get just outside the town centre, you get a whole bunch of detached houses, which broadly speaking is the wrong density. It doesn't actually put enough population close to where the actual stuff is, and actually in many ways is unsustainable. So this was saying, look, you need to have a certain scale of building to achieve a certain density, a certain level of continuity and enclosure. So you only had a certain amount of setback at this point. Buildings more or less have to be kind of joined together because in terms of density and everything else, unless of course it was a campus or a university or a hospital or something, and then you've got a bit more flexibility about space around it. And then a bit further out, here's Zone 3, so that would be up to 2.5 stories max, with different parameters set for how the servicing and parking would work and everything else. In both cases here, you can see in the higher density area in Zone 2, car parking is not to be on the forecourt at the front, and broadly speaking as well in Zone 3 that you have to have a garden, and the car parking will probably be at the side of the house or or to the rear, which you tend to see in more traditional sort of housing types. And probably the biggest argument I had, I think, with developers at the time was that I was saying was actually you had to have 2 meters to the fence, not 2 meters between, at which point it would appear that I was trying to put everybody out of business. But that was all codified in. So the means by which we actually did start to look at local distinctiveness, I think this is where some of the more subtleties of local distinctiveness and character can be picked out. And I don't think you can do that entirely on your own. This was done by sort of crowdsourcing. So we used, I don't know whether we use this, I'm talking to the young planners, whether anybody still uses Flickr, but broadly speaking, we set up a Flickr page. I think it might still be, I think it's Darlington Design Quality, and people were invited to send their pictures of what made Darlington the town that it is. So broadly speaking, there are various different forms that you see. Not that you don't see them in other places, it's more the fact that these are the ones you do see and there's other ones you just don't see, if that makes any sense. So these are the ones that you will pick up on, and a lot of people sent in their ideas about, oh, this is how windows should be, this is how you maybe tackle a wider opening with a more composite window form that's got a proper mullion down the middle and everything else, how you do headers and footers, the types of bay windows. And broadly speaking, there's one form of bay window you're just not going to see anywhere, which is the single one with the pitched roof on top, which I always think looks absolutely awful, but there we are. Luckily, nobody sent one of those in, but anyway, it probably would have got edited out. So broadly speaking, though, it does give you quite a lot of instructions about how to do that, even down to the solid to void ratios of the wall and everything else. Going back to our Dutch example, yes, to be fair, somebody had started to express that in terms of what you would normally see in the Netherlands. If you cast your mind back to your trips there, you'll see that there's a lot more window in the walls than you would see up here often. Use of materials, brick, certainly no purple ones. And certainly I think the whole point was trying to avoid those awful things that you tend to see on the side of everybody's ring road, which is a now probably empty purple office building in sort of generic purpley brick. Something around local brick colours I think is really important, how you use stone, good tradition of using ceramics, for example. And he's pulling out those things that actually do make your place distinctive. I think it's really important. So you can go from like really big priorities and sort of more strategic stuff down to detail. And I think it's possible to actually do that. You may have noticed that timber cladding, for example, is not something you would find in the town centre, because it's just not the sort of material that stands up very well often to that kind of environment, although that environment is now changing because as vehicles have got cleaner, there are less particulates, so you end up with less black cedar cladding than you did before. I think one thing that we're trying to iron out is the tragedy, I think, the tragedy of what we see as being effectively suburban development, which went on for a long time. So this series of disconnected cul-de-sacs, I think, is something that still needs to be stamped out. And I know that sounds very, very extreme, but broadly speaking, right up until I left local government, I was still seeing not dissimilar forms to this being proposed. And I do think that this is inherently problematic, because actually from a car-based point of view, yeah, you can get about, but you really couldn't or wouldn't want to walk anywhere. So as you can see, you're passing down the street. This is pretty average stuff. Open plan. Does anybody think it actually works? I don't. I think houses without an appropriate boundary doesn't actually create the street enclosure you'd actually want. Pass on down the street. No, look, there's the I think they're the affordable ones at the end. But then at 183 or whatever it is, that's what you're faced with. So you got the next just over that fence cul-de-sac that you can't walk to. You know, you might have mates over there, anything, you can't get there. So this sort of thing is utterly tragic, and you still see it. You still see new developments that are done like this, where you might be asking till you're blue in the face, saying, well, can we like not just have those connected up? And then, you know, they'll say, oh, we could, but you know, we're not. And then you end up with a private shared drive just to make absolutely sure as well that it's not ever going to connect up, which I think is utterly, utterly tragic. And it wasn't until Jamie Oliver pointed out that turkey Twizzlers were probably making our children at least less than well, or would in the long term be affecting their health. We need somebody effectively, and I don't think it'd be Kevin McLeod, by the way, but we do need somebody to actually call out what we consider to be normal development and say, well, actually, this is making us ill. You know, and cul-de-sacs, car-based developments like this have got a track record of actually making our society less well. And it just needs saying. So I'm hoping nobody out there is currently promoting or a bunch of disconnected cul-de-sacs. And certainly from a local authority point of view, you know, if you do nothing, you know, it's like you've got one job, is to make sure that things are joined up, because that way at least you can just walk around and get about, you know, in a healthy way. And obviously putting that sort of thing right is really, really difficult. But I think one of the things that I think has really changed everybody's perception, I think it's partly a sign of the times, is that there's a greater recognition now of the importance of the natural world, connection to green infrastructure, the quality of that green infrastructure, how accessible that is when you walk out of your front door. So I think that realization is actually really, really important. So here they have some people forest bathing. You know, this, you know, 15, 20 years ago, in my other employments and everything else, I've been, you know, marginally attached to the new age, as you'd say, and people just thought, yeah, a bit mad though, aren't you? But actually, this is now becoming the orthodoxy that broadly speaking, you know, our connection with nature is the thing that actually keeps us well. And broadly speaking, the more we can keep that narrative going, I think the more we stand a better chance without thinking about design coding or beauty or something. You know, there ain't nothing more beautiful than nature, and nature really should be part of a lot more part of our lives and made consciously part of new designs, new developments. Okay. Here's some things you'll hear tripped out at you when somebody's describing their building and wants you to like it, shall we say. Form follows function, says Louis Sullivan. The plan is the generator, says Le Corbusier. Less is more, says Mies van der Rohe. And less is a bore, says Robert Venturi. So, here we are, Louis Sullivan. Now, what right did he have to say that form follows function? Because there's a few other things going on here, isn't there? So, broadly speaking, yeah, this building might be quite functional, but look at the decoration. You know, so anybody who wants to justify their rather denuded looking building without a huge amount of that and says, oh, form follows function, well, you know what to do, don't you? You can say, well, I think different. Here we are, so here's Le Corbusier. Coming to a university campus near you on the right. But broadly speaking, this is what's defined modernity. And if you watch things like Grand Designs, this really hasn't gone away. You know, this is what modernity looks like, even though it's like 1920s or something. And typically the one on the right, brilliant, because actually, you know, how do you get in? It's quite clear from that building just on your right that's just sneaking around the corner, you get into the front door. But with this sort of thing, you'd be like walking around for a while, wouldn't you, before you thought, well, where's the front door then? And here we are. This is even more so. You'll see award-winning schemes that aren't dissimilar to Mies van der Rohe's Farnsworth House. And here we are, another one of Mies van der Rohe's coming to a rates hall near you at your local council offices probably, is a building not dissimilar. And broadly speaking, this became the language that defined it. And here we are, Robert Venturi is coming to a ring road near you. But underlying all this stuff is, and this is the point I want to make, is, and I know I've got about 5 minutes left here, is aesthetics. And there is something about this. So broadly speaking, underpinning most good forms that we like are things like the golden section. So here we are, this is the golden ratio. Turn that on this end, you get a very nice window proportion. You know, actually, when you've spent enough time doing this sort of thing, it just naturally happens like that. But that's the head, hand, heart of a designer, not necessarily the CAD machine, and not necessarily potato stamping out different house types. But to be fair, I do believe if you got those house types kind of right and you had a bit more sensibility about what the proportions were, you might actually head towards something quite beautiful like this, because this is what nature does. And all that math that underlies all that is what you'll see in that flower when it, you know, its seed head. But it's everywhere in our environment. So the Apple logo is actually based on the golden ratio. Now, whether somebody at Apple went, oh, I want to use the golden ratio, I don't know. But broadly speaking, lots of these things happen because people are designing stuff with the right proportions. And it's sort of, I won't say it's totally universal, but there is something in this about certainly how we perceive things. Equally, you can have a bit of fun with it as well, because we do seem to want to make things out of other things. So here's a couple of examples of what they call a sort of gestalt, really, of putting things together that aren't really related, that look a bit like a face. So there are aesthetic considerations we need to be aware of in terms of our own psychology, because that does have an impact. So you might enjoy that one, which is my favorite, which is the chicken building. But broadly speaking, we do put things together in certain ways in our heads, which does give us an aesthetics that is, broadly speaking, we do think in more or less the same way and have some shared experience of this stuff. So sometimes when you look at it, you go, that just ain't right. You know what? It probably just isn't right. So here we are. Here's an example of a high street, one near you. And you can see in all this, what I want to try and get over is there's a large degree of variety. There's also a large degree of consistency as well. There are limits to how wide your building is. There are limits to how high your building is. But if you expressed it in terms of height, you might be missing a point, because actually what it is, it's the variety of people's approaches to different story heights, for example, that gives you that variety within. There are materials here that work very well together in many ways, if it's through half closed eyes, as I say, but you better spot the ones that don't really work out quite so well. And within all this, you can codify all that sort of stuff, and you can start to get an appreciation of how all these different elements all work together to give you a sense of place. And I do maintain there's lots of towns you go to, broadly speaking, whether that's probably more regionally and sub-regionally, that you do have a sense of where you are in the country as well. And in this case here, this was the A1 that used to go up and down here. So this was the information superhighway from medieval times, to be fair. So you have got a reasonably large variety of architecture, but equally a variety of consistency. Okay, genius loci. There are two sorts of people. If you read the book, read Christian Norberg Schultz's Genius Loci. There's basically just two sorts of people. There's people who like nature and everything else, but they like it kind of over there somewhere, which is example on the left here, which is classical thinking. And then there's Nordic thinking, which is people who really want nature right up close and next door to them and everything else. There's one example of Genius Loci in terms of how people relate to the environment around them, and those two, they're just two examples of two very different ways of looking at nature and everything else. I couldn't resist it anyway. If anybody ever tells you that they can't afford to do something, just have a think again, maybe, because, you know, I would have thought that that canopy you're after wouldn't be really out of the way, but there we are. And in many ways, one of the things we could achieve if we were to start to influence the products that people are buying, and they are products that people are buying in terms of the you know, mass market housing, for example, is to try and make everything as far as possible as good as you'd make at home, and try and knock off the worst excesses of things being designed to a cost, which is obviously a consideration, but broadly speaking, our what good looks like should be trying to get the everyday as good as this, or at least create the conditions in planning for people to do more stuff on their own or at smaller scales, because that way you get a greater connection to the quality aspects of what's gone in, effectively the ingredients. Just give you the last couple of examples of how you can possibly make things worse by trying to make things better. This is a town near me. Clearly the applicant, I do have the sense of the backstory of this, was told that really, I know you want to go up in your bungalow, but broadly speaking, we're not having two-story stuff at this part. I don't know why, but there's a local context. There are two-story things, but I do know that there was some advice that we won't be having a two-story house. If you look just over here, you might find there's some design cues. Watch out for those, because they're immediate context. You might want to pick up on them, equally you might not. So as you can see, typically there's another one that's been extended upwards. So it was a bungalow and now it's a 1.5-story job. And look what you end up with, isn't that wonderful? So, you know, you've got something that's actually got some chapel design cues. It's got the porch from I don't know where. It's got a bifold door that's like whacked on. But what's worst of all is it would have been far better, I think, if it had actually been a 2-story building in trying to cram all this stuff into a form that's really not done it. It's like somebody stuck a foot pump underneath it and blown it up, rather than actually created something that's got any art to it. Here we are. And then finally, I'd say finally, I hope this is it. If you ever, I've had to sit in meetings where the advice has been like cringing, going, oh no, yeah, I'll have to break up the massing, because broadly speaking, yeah, you can, but this is what can happen. You do break it up to the point where it looks like a very bad painting. So in terms of what we're doing as planners, broadly speaking, the more we can get up here, the more we're going to have a really, really good chance of actually getting a good outcome in terms of design. And I'm going to go, this is from the Planning Officers Society, it isn't just me, but broadly speaking, designing is part of it. So don't be afraid to actually get in there and start to be confident about what works and what doesn't work. And through all these different processes, you can go through all this through development management. And broadly speaking, obviously, it's all gone wrong here. But broadly speaking, somewhere in here, there are opportunities all the way, not all the way, but most of the way down here, to actually promote the quality of place, engage with applicants and everything else, and then do some negotiations. But I do think the best thing you could do is actually work out what the key measures of success would be. End of show. Click exit. So, quarter of an hour for questions, I believe.
Thank you very much, Tim, for that presentation. So yeah, if you do have any questions, there should be a sort of box on the side where you can enter them, and I'll pick them up. I've got some prepared as well. So just, I suppose, just draw on a couple of things from the presentation. You obviously mentioned cul-de-sac sort of type development, and you've mentioned things that planners can do in engaging with applicants. But I think to me, sort of design guidance feels very much more like a carrot rather than a stick. You know, if you talk to the volume house builders, they will defend that model as being based on extensive customer research. So, I mean, what can sort of planners, and particularly young planners, do to try and sort of, I suppose, educate sounds a bit patronizing, but talk to actual people who are buying these products to make them demand more from the house builders?
Okay, I suppose I'm being a little bit ambitious that actually, I don't think there's enough, and this is ambitious, entertaining telly, shall we say. So what we haven't got is that kind of tour around some of the worst excesses and really calling it out. And I don't think the media has actually given us a platform to do that. Although there used to be programs that did used to feature people from the built environment as heroic figures as well. So that UFO program, you know, there was a guy called, he was an architect really, wasn't he? You know what I mean? Now, what we haven't got is heroic built environment people in the same sense that kind of get these messages over. In terms of from a young planner's point of view, I don't know. I mean, maybe I'd be interested in people's views, but just because people want it doesn't mean to say it's right, and it's not right for the next generation. So if you're a car owning home buyer right now, who they have profiled, by the way, you know, the house builders know who you are. I'm not going to say, I cannot repeat what one said to me, because they profiled it down to like an individual person that I probably knew, you know, and he was even down the bifold door and the colour of the kitchen and everything. And they've profiled that person, and you're going, well, that's like, so I think though, if we've got strong views about it, and I sometimes think it's just me, but as young planners, you know, if you think it's wrong, keep saying so. And I do think that there's something in that, and I know it's not easy to do, and there's a lot of the times, you know, you're having to represent your client if you're on that side. But broadly speaking, it's not right, is it? You know. I think that's and again, I'm not criticizing anybody, but it's sometimes you end up trying to make something that's fundamentally not right, and actually you need to go right back to the beginning and go, look what we're trying to do here, you know. And I do think that lack of connectivity, but there's also it depends on where you're working. There's a political element to this as well, and I do think that we need a lot more awareness from elected members as well, because, you know, all people have to do is just say rat running, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, we can't possibly have that, to be rat running. And you're like, no, it's just people getting about, innit, you know. So I do think we've got to try and get rid of some of the truisms that keep floating around in this stuff. Yeah.
Absolutely, thank you. And you mentioned Poundbury as well as a sort of the textbook example when people are talking about design codes. My understanding is that that's very much the landowner driving that forward. It's the Prince of Wales and the Duchy of Cornwall. So to what extent are you aware of landowners having views on these things generally? Do they get involved in that kind of stage, or are they just trying to cash out and get the sort of top price for their plots?
Yeah, I've got a really good example from because I worked alongside the actual landowner stroke developer. And I won't say it's perfect, but it's better than sometimes, is West Park in Darlington when I worked there, because Tony Cooper, as the landowner, had a strong view about the sort of things that he wanted in it and the ingredients list and how it would put together, and picked the architect and had a view about how public space would work, and went to the trouble himself of hiring a poet to be part of the public realm strategy, and then got the County Durham Foundation in to do the maintenance and management. So all those things you can do if you're the landowner. If you're just sold your field to somebody, well, that's it. It's game over, isn't it? You know, you're gonna get what you're gonna get, unless you've got motivated landowners. Now, I'm not going to point fingers, but I know I've been in meetings with landowners who really should know better, yeah, who have got a social function. You know, something bigger than the day job, who have basically pointed out, well, yeah, that's going to harm our viability if we start asking for stuff like that. Well, but you know, you get an idea who you are. You know? So I think it is important, and I think that goes back to another thing as well. And I think if you look at some of the stuff that's out there, like garden cities or the garden village things that are out at the moment, the thing that fundamentally underpins all that, if you're looking at that type of development that's worked, is the actual ownership model of the land, and the fact that really you have long-term stewardship, and that's the bit that makes it really, really good, rather than just, oh, it looks a bit like Bourneville, you know. I mean, that's the, you know, it's like the new, I was going to say the new chocolate box, but you know what I'm saying? It's like it looks like it, therefore it is, and actually without the mechanisms underneath, it just plainly won't be. Because everything that's not private has to be public, and everything that's public has to be adoptable. And if it's adoptable, it's got to be cheap and resilient. So broadly speaking, unless you've got somebody, and this is a big role. You know, I'll let you ask the question in a second, but my big soapbox at the moment is that we need to be doing it differently in terms of what happens when big developments come along, like your big urban extension, everything else. Quite often local authorities are nowhere near that, because they're not the landowner. It's been done in a land deal and everything else. And actually, there's a lot of benefits could be gained by bringing partnerships into this. So you want your social infrastructure, and you want it in the first 20 years, not the last 30. You know, how do you get in there first with slow money that's prepared to wait for things like, you know, community halls, pump priming, getting retail going, green infrastructure. There's a whole bunch of things that local authorities could be doing in partnership and doing joint ventures and everything. But then taking that one stage further. Controversially, I know we should be, I think, allocating stuff and then getting it in the hands of the public purse and extracting the value out of it. But there you are. That's that. We should do that directly. You know, it shouldn't be a bonanza when your land's allocated. It should be like, oh, right, okay. Anyway.
Fair enough. Yeah, no, absolutely. I think there's definitely a growing role for sort of development corporations in this kind of stuff. So on that, then, would you say that there should be probably more of an emphasis in pre-app discussion on design?
Yes, and I think it shouldn't be seen as what I tend to characterise is that we'll tell you what, yeah, we've done all that stuff now, and we've talked about viability, and we've done all this other stuff, and tell you what, we'll put our two designers together and see if they can sort it out. And you're like, this is it's way too late, you know, the point at which you introduce two. And usually in a big meeting as well, so they'll be like, you'll be there as like the local authority urban designer, and there's 6 on the other side, you know, and they like go, oh, and here's our ecologist, and here's our urban designer, and this sort of stuff, and it's too late at that point, you know, and it's all pretty well sealed and fixed, and you do see that, you get a layout that once it's got houses on it, it's like, God, you've really done the math here, haven't you? Because somehow the meetings happen further up where those houses, every one of them's got like a dollar sign on it, you know. So you have to take 3 out. Whoa, man, you know, and it's that type of thing. But like I always say, irritatingly to some, I suppose, it doesn't cost any more to put things in the right place, does it? Really? But I mean, that's quite a harsh view in many ways, but it's true. So yeah, absolutely. In Preapp, Preapp, I've got other strong views about this, but at the moment, Preapp's slightly dysfunctional because, broadly speaking, you always have to pay to make an application and then find that you haven't had it looked at really. What you've got is a kind of view, and because you're that arm's length, whereas I remember a time where, to be fair, you better rock up with a plan under your arm and actually have a conversation with somebody for nothing. And I think you can iron out quite a lot of rubbish at that point. And it's a different attitude, isn't it? It's not, look, I paid me money, now give me some service. It's much more consultative. So I'd go back to it seems mad these days with all the situation we're in. But you know, when you actually walk into your plan reception, it's got like round tables that you can all sit around, and you can get excited, and you can get up and you can get a pen out and everything. Now, you know, you sat in the same booth that you deal with your council tax, and your chair's bolted down, and the officer comes in from the side. Like, that isn't well, it shouldn't be how we do planning. You know, these are multi-million-pound investments for everybody who comes in. You'd think it'd be different to that, wouldn't you? I mean, equally, I think you shouldn't have a bolted down chair in the council tax department either, but there you are. That's just the way it is, isn't it? You know. Yeah.
Okay. I've had a question coming from a member of the audience. They are asking, in your opinion, of course, what is the worst thing about planning or design of UK cities and towns?
Well, cul-de-sacs. Cul-de-sacs. Get rid of them. Absolutely. I think that to me is the thing, that lack of connectivity. Now, I mean, broadly speaking, it doesn't have to be a cul-de-sac in terms of a twiddly thing with houses along it. Anything that actually doesn't allow the free movement of people. So you're ranging from gated communities to actually as well, privatized public space as well. I think that's another thing that's sneaking up on us. And I think that it can have its benefits, it can work, but also in many ways it can be very sterile as well. And when the money runs out, so does the quality sometimes. So yeah, but no, mainly cul-de-sacs. Sorry, that was probably an obvious answer.
No, fair enough. Brilliant. Suppose I would next ask, you know, we have people on the call who are looking to develop their design skills. Is there sort of any advice you would offer them on what they could seek out or what they should look to do for that?
Yeah. Okay. There's one orthodoxy, and what you need to do is go to loads of seminars and go on foreign study tours and go and see how they do it in the Netherlands, and then come home and weep about it because actually it's a completely different planning system. And then you come back and go, why is it like that here? Oh. And then I did hear rather cynically from one consultant that does more or less what I do now said, oh, it's all right, it's dead easy, my job. I just go and point to things in the Netherlands, and that's what you're having, you know. And you're like, oh, no, none of that. Okay, yes, it's important. Yes, it's good. It's great. And you do go and see some stuff, and you go, oh, that's really nice, that. Drawing. I mean, it sounds really stupid, but drawing, getting an aesthetic sense, getting a sense of the stuff that's around you. It's like, it's all the whole sort of Gordon Cullen's sort of townscape stuff. It's that appreciation of just the sort of lightness and proportion of and actually how buildings relate back to you. I think is to have the appreciation of that means that it would actually become, it's a longer journey, but it's a more fluent journey when you're actually describing to somebody what works and what doesn't, you know. Also, hang out with your local friendly conservation officer, because they've got an eye for this stuff as well. And I really do. I think there's a huge resource of knowledge and passion in conservation, and it's often like it's something that's over there and it just deals with a list of buildings. And I think that's a real shame, because actually the very skills that are in that conservation team, you know, and often, you know, it's unfortunate because the nature of the job, people can end up being a bit hard bitten sometimes, but they are absolutely the people that are the go-tos for understanding your local character, because they do the characterization, stuff like that, or on the fly have to advise people all the time anyway about aesthetics or quality or whatever. So I think there's a lot to learn from the historic environment. And then on top of that, get clued up with what the future is, because one thing I would say is, as planners, you know, we're effectively futurists, and people say to me at parties, what do you do? And to avoid the conversation where they say, oh, it's a nightmare, I've got this terrible problem with planning, you know, I can't get the extension built or something like that, I just say, I'm from the future. That's what I do. I'm from the future. So get yourself up to speed with what's happening. You know, what's new out there, what's contemporary. But I don't mean contemporary as in looks like Mies van der Rohe. I mean, like, what's going to happen next? Because we need to know that, because that's what we do. We need to know what's happening next. Nobody else does. Well, they do, but we know better, you know.
Well, that is a good lead. So I'm going to ask one more question as we're almost at the half-past mark. Speaking of the future, obviously, the topical question, how do you think design is going to change in response to COVID? You know, things like social distancing, the fact that we're all probably going to end up working from home a lot more, increased active travel, that kind of area.
Right.
What do you see and what do you hope?
Yeah, what do I see and what do I hope?
Yeah.
Well, what I see, which is a bit depressing, is that the town and city centres are going to have yet another another foundation taken away from them, really, because actually footfall and people in town and being comfortable and enjoying it's everything. But equally, the enhancement and improvement of our suburbs would be just like a great thing anyway. I think a great appreciation of public accessible green space and all that, I think, is really, really important. So that's the only plus. On the other side, in terms of tackling what's left in the middle, because potentially people will want to work from home and everything else, we need to re-establish the town centre as a community hub. It needs to be something that serves your everyday needs, beyond just your stuff you get in your own suburb, because otherwise what you do is you end up in your suburbs. You're not going to have that real cultural benefit of the town centre. So I think we'll get through this. You know, I don't think in 5 years' time we'll all be doing the same social distancing we are now. And I think we've got a plan for what that will look like the other side. So I think habits will change because people will work from home more, which I think is brilliant, and I think that will make people more community focused. But I also think we've got to reinvent quite quickly what we think town centres and city centres are doing then. And then weirdly, you might find people that are actually coming in not to work, but to play, which should be a great thing, you know, because actually then you start to reimagine what it's all about and the amount of time you spend there and what you spend there. So there.
Thank you very much, Tim.
No worries. Thank you.
Just going to hand back to Katherine.
I've returned again. Tim, thank you so much for that presentation. I think the one thing I'm going to take away from it particularly is I'm actually going to go walk around my local area and have a little bit more of an in-depth think of the design of it and what's gone into it. I think that's probably quite a good exercise to do, just walking outside my door. So that's kind of definitely some thought-provoking stuff there. Just to say thank you very much for your presentation, and thank you to Daniel for doing the Q&As. We had a little good selection there, so it was a good discussion at the end. Just for those listening, there'll be a feedback form that will be sent to you all, and we'd really appreciate it if you could try and complete it. This is the first one in the Northeast specifically we've done, so from our perspective, it would be really great if we could get back your views back as well. But I have to say it is 1:30. It's lunchtime for some. So thank you very much, and we'll see you at the next presentation.
Thank you.